Hello guys, the long anticipated wait for the Mini Cooper S engine rebuild is finally over. Before we get into things, make sure you give this video a like. It really does help me out and it shows your appreciation. Now then, today in this video I want to get the engine block fully reassembled. Now I have already went ahead and done a couple of jobs prior to today, so I've already checked all of the piston ring gaps. So top compression ring end gap has to be between 0.25 and 0.35. So try 0.4. Of course it doesn't go in. 0.3 doesn't want to go in. 0.25, which is the bottom limit, that goes in. So we're somewhere between 0.25 and 0.3 for the top compression ring. Second compression ring going in. End gaps for this is 0.35 to 0.5. So we'll start with 0.5. It doesn't go in. 0.4 doesn't go in. 0.3 should go in, but we'll try 0.35. Yep, 0.35 goes in. So again, on the bottom limit for that, which as you would expect. And they measure up absolutely perfect, right on the bottom limits, as you would expect, because the engine block has already been rebored and the new piston rings and new pistons measure up absolutely spot on. Now, speaking on the pistons, I want to say a massive thanks to Lim Engine Components. They are a company here in the UK. They supply all different kinds of engine parts, engine components, and a few of the different types of parts as well. But they actually supplied the pistons for this build. Now, the pistons themselves, as you probably know, they are 0.25mm oversized. Now, I don't know what I would have done without Lim Engine Components. You know, like I said, they supplied the pistons along with a set of piston rings. So yeah, a massive thanks to them. And guys, if you do want to check them out, there will be some links down in the description box below. So yeah, if you want to get yourself any engine parts, then do consider checking them out. I think they were actually the cheapest price when I was looking for a set of pistons for this car anyway. So yeah, do go ahead and check them out. Now, like I said, I've already done a few things prior to today. One thing was checking the piston ring gaps. I've also thoroughly cleaned the engine block itself. So there is two parts. One part, the main part, is underneath this towel here. There is the part, the bottom, I guess it's like the mains end cap carrier. That's over to one side. That's been thoroughly cleaned as well. The crankshaft, that is securely tucked away in this wrapping here. That has been thoroughly cleaned. I made sure all of the oil galleries are, absolutely spotless. So that is all done. Now, first thing we need to do today is start measuring all of the oil clearances and also the crankshaft end float. Now, I do have brand new thrust washers. These are just standard size thrust washers. I probably should have checked the end float before I ordered those, but it is what it is. If we find out that we have excessive end float, now of course we will have to get oversized thrust washers, but it is what it is. So yeah, I think first and foremost we will start with checking the oil clearances on the big end bearings. So let's get on to doing that right now. Okay then, so let's get started. And I know what you're all thinking. Why is the crankshaft sitting on a couple of blocks of wood? Now, of course, because we are going to be checking the big end oil clearances first. We're going to be checking the main bearing oil clearances after. I think it's going to be easier to actually do it with the crankshaft outside of the engine block. Now, when I disassembled the engine, I noticed it was pretty tight, I guess because of the nature of the engine, of the engine block. There is no mains caps. It is, just two sections of an engine block sandwiched together. It was very, very tight to get the big end bearing caps off. So obviously we're going to have to, cross that bridge when it comes to proper reassembly. But just to check the oil clearances, with some plastic gauge, I don't think we need to, have the crankshaft in the block. I think it's just going to be much easier, much quicker to do it while it is on this jig here. It's just a couple of pieces of wood just resting on the mains bearings on either side. So essentially what we'll do is have the rod going from underneath. We will apply some plastic gauge on the top, and then we can drop our big end bearing cap on top and then torque down the bolts and then see the results once we remove it. Now I do just want to state I have already measured all of the journals. So I've measured the big end and the main journals and they all measure within spec. And if you're wondering what the specs are, so for the main bearing journals on the petrol engines, it should be between 44.984 to 45 millimeters, which it was. That is for the main bearing journals. Then for the big end bearing journals, it should be between 40.975 and 40.991 millimeters, which again it was. So the journals themselves, they measure absolutely fine, but I guess for peace of mind and the fact that we should always, the fact that you should always check twice, we are going to be using some plastic gauge. Now, using plastic gauge by itself is not the most accurate of things, but it is hopefully going to highlight any inconsistencies if we see any between the journals themselves. So yeah, let's get cracking with this stuff now. Okay, so this piston I have here is from cylinder number 4, which is the flywheel end. So that is going to be for this big end journal right here. I've already installed the bearings to them. If you're wondering which bearings we're using these King bearings. They're supposed to be pretty good. You obviously don't want to skimp out on bearings, but yeah, that's that anyway. So I guess we should get our plastic gauge ready. If you're wondering what it looks like, it just comes in these small strips. I'm just going to break a tiny piece off. Just apply it to the top. Of course, you want to make sure that the journals themselves are clean. I've already cleaned them with some brake cleaner, and the bearings as well, they should be dry. We'll then get our piston and rod. Slide this up into position, and we can install our bearing cap. Start tightening down the bolts, and now it's time to torque down both of those bolts. Now of course you want to reuse the old bolts. They are fine for checking the oil clearances, but when it comes to proper reinstallation, you want to make sure you have new bolts. So stage 1 is 5 Newton meters. There's 5. There's 5. Stage 2 is 10 Newton meters. There's 1. There's 2. And the next stage is angle tighten a further 130 degrees. There's one. There's two. Now we can crack both of the bolts loose again. And remove the cap itself. And the rod, of course. As you can see, we are left with a spatter of Plastigauge. Now again, it's not 100% accurate, but it should give us a good ballpark figure. But putting it next to the Plastigauge gauge, we are looking at around 0.038, so that's 38 microns of oil clearance, which I think is about where it should be for this engine. I'm sure I've seen it somewhere that should be between 0.025 and 0.045 millimeters. So we are pretty much bang in the middle between those two numbers. So I guess we should clean this off and then do the exact same for the other three as well. Okay, so this is for cylinder 3, and again, pretty similar situation around the 0.038 mark. And pretty much the same for cylinder 2 as well. And finally for cylinder number 1, around the same again. Somewhere between 0.038 and 0.050. So yeah, I think we're all good for the big end bearing journals. Next then, it's time to check the main bearing oil clearances. So as you can see, I have the main section of the engine block right here. First things first, I need to install the upper main bearings themselves. Now these do actually have a notch in them, as you can see just there. So 5 of these bearings should have a notch in them, and they will be the upper bearings. Then the other 5, they will be the lower bearings. And so of course remove the new bearings. And again, when you do this, you want to make sure that all of the bearing caps are completely free of any oil, because that will alter the Plastigauge reading. So yeah, I've thoroughly cleaned all of the bearing caps, and we can just drop the new bearings in place using the locator tab. Again, make sure they're nice and uniform and level. You can also drop our new thrust washers in place as well. And now we can drop the crankshaft itself in place. Yeah, just make sure the thrust washers are still located. So here's how we're looking. Okay then, so it's time to check the crankshaft end float, and as you can see I have a DTI gauge set up there, just a device, don't have a stand for it or anything, but it should do the job still just the same. This is an imperial one, so we'll need to convert that to metric, but again should still work just the same. Now the crankshaft end float for the N14 engine, well I guess for all petrol engines, is between 0.015 and 0.050, which is 15 to 50 microns. Now I already know we are way over that, because just moving the crankshaft from side to side, I can physically see it moving, and we should not have that much movement. That is not 15 to 50 microns. So I know that these standard size thrush washers are going to be no good. We're going to have to get some kind of oversized ones, but we will check, we'll try and get an exact measurement so we know how much oversized we need to go. So we will set this to 0. There we are. And now let's move this all the way across. And that done an entire rotation, and it's gone round again for an extra 2 thou. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So that's around 12 thou of end float, which, converting that to metric, is around 305 microns, which is way too much. We need to be between 15 and 50 microns. So yeah, these standard size thrush washers are no good. I'm thinking of getting oversize 0.25 or 0.3 millimeters. I'll have to see what is available to buy, but yeah, I'm glad that I definitely did go ahead and check this end float, because yeah, way too much. If I was to leave this as it is, you'd just get a clunk on acceleration. This is way too excessive. But I guess we can continue with checking the oil clearances. So as you can see, I have applied a small amount of plastic gauge to all of the main journals. And I've also installed the new mains caps bearings as well. We can flip this over and drop it into position. There we are, and then begin installing all of the old bolts. Again, when it comes to proper reinstallation, these need to be replaced. One-time use only. Okay then, so all of the mains bolts are back in. There is 2 stages to the torquing sequence. First stage is 30 Newton meters, so 30 Newton meters to all of the bolts, and then it is 150 degrees rotation. So we get the 30 Newton meters done first. There's one. 10. That's the first stage done. And it's time for the 150 degrees rotation. Which is fun when the engine's not on an engine stand. Whew. That's all 10 mains bolts torqued down. Now we've got to remove them all again. It was almost as if it had been silicone back on. Okay, so before we even take any kind of measurements, first thing that's good to see is we have what looks to be a good consistency between each of the journals. They all look to be pretty much exactly the same. But we'll see what the old plastic gauge tells us. So yeah, again, a similar sort of story between 0.038 and 0.050. I'd say it's closer to 0.38 than it is 0.50 though. And yeah, same again. So yeah, all of the mains journals are between 0.38 and 0.50, so that's 38 microns to 50 microns, which again, it's not the most accurate thing in the world, but it just gives you some peace of mind to, you know, show us that we don't have like a dodgy journal. They all are pretty much matching up. Okay then, so it's around 2 weeks later now, and I'm pretty sure I ended off last time explaining how we have too much end float. I think it was around 12 thou or 300 microns. So I actually done this off camera, but I thought I would just check the end float with the original thrust washers in, which are these ones right here. And funnily enough, I then ended up with 8 thou or around 200 microns of end float. And so I thought, okay, there's something wrong here. The new thrust washers that I have are obviously the wrong ones. You know, they're not for this engine, even though they were supplied supposedly for an N14 mini engine. They're obviously the wrong ones. And I noticed as well there was a slight difference in the design as well. So I thought, yeah, they're definitely the wrong ones. And then I thought, you know what, I'm actually going to measure the wear on the original thrust washers. And believe it or not, there was only like 10 microns or less of wear on the original ones. So I thought, that's very strange. How do we have 8 thou of end float, but only around 10 microns of wear on the thrust washers? Something wasn't adding up. So then I thought, you know what, I'm going to go away, I'm going to try and buy some oversized thrust washers to compensate for the excessive end float, or so I thought at the time. And yeah, long story short, oversized thrust washers for this engine do not exist. And I know what you're thinking, oh, why don't you contact this company, why don't you contact this company? I've tried. I've been to everyone who specializes in these engines. all of them say the same thing. They've never seen or heard of oversized thrust washers for this engine. And then I was a bit confused. I was sort of left scratching my head thinking, you know, these engines are rebuilt on a daily basis. I could not be the only one that has excessive crankshaft end float. You know, there's no way that that the end float has worn, you know, 150 microns plus. And then I was sort of thinking, you know what? I don't know if these actually came from factory with 15 to 50 microns of wear. And I actually looked through the technical information in the Haynes manual again, and then I noticed that it said up to 300 microns of, let me actually double check, I don't want to get this wrong. Axial play, or the end float of the crankshaft, 300 microns wear limit. I have no idea what the difference between the end float and the end float wear limit is. Why is the end float supposed to be between 15 and 50 microns, but then the wear limit is up to 300 microns? It makes no sense whatsoever. So then I thought I would contact my good friend Lee from Barham Engines. He was the guy who actually bored the block. If you guys saw that video, you'll know it all too well. And I had a conversation and I basically explained the situation, and he said that, you know, it's not uncommon for him to actually run around 8 thou of end float on his engines. You know, he's seen up to 12 or 15 thou of end float on some engines, and so this kind of gave me some comfort. It put my mind at rest, and I was sort of thinking at that point, you know, there's no way that this engine came from factory with 15 to 50 microns. He did say if there was wear on the block or the crank itself, you would see it and it wouldn't look pretty. So, you know, visually inspecting the crank, it doesn't look like there is any wear on it. And like I said, on the thrust washers themselves, there's less than 10 microns of wear. So yeah, I'm pretty convinced that these N14 engines do not come from factory with 15 to 50 microns of end float. And so I am actually going to be working on the bigger end of things, the 300 micron wear limit. Like I said, with the original thrust washers, I'm sitting right in the middle at around 200 microns or 8 thou of end float. And so I thought, okay, I'm not going to use those new thrust washers because they were given around 12 thou of end float. And then I thought, I'm just going to go to BMW, I'm just going to get a brand new set of genuine thrust washers, and that way I know that they're correct. Here's where the story gets interesting again. I go to BMW. I thought, you know what, I'm going to take my caliper gauge to BMW. I want to make sure that these are correct. I go to the parts department, pick up the new thrust washers, measure them, and they're the exact same as the aftermarket ones that I'd already bought. And so they would have given me around 12 thou of end float. So I thought, these are no good. I then asked a few questions to the guy at the parts department. I said, these are not the correct ones. Can you please just double and triple check that these are the correct part number? He said, yeah, these are the correct part number. I then shown him the original thrust washers, and I said, can you check the part number on these? And he said, yeah, this is a real part number on the original ones, but this was the old part number. So essentially the new thrust washers, you know, the new part number has been updated to add around 100 extra microns of end float. So yeah, no idea why BMW or Mini made this change to add even more end float, but yeah, I don't really want to run up to 12 thou, which is around 300 microns of end float, because then that will be right on the top wear limit. So long story short, I'm going to use the original thrust washers and just run around 8 thou of end float. Sorry that this has been, you know, a bit of a long story, but I wanted to clear a few things up. I'm guessing I cannot be the only one who is experiencing this issue. Like I said, these are very, very common engines to fail. They must be rebuilt on an almost daily basis. So yeah, hopefully if any of you guys are following along, this has hopefully cleared a few things up. If your original thrust washers are fine, they don't have any wear on them, then just run them again. That is what I am doing, because more than likely the new thrust washers, they will have excessive end flow on them, and they'll be no good anyway. So yeah, we are going to continue with the rebuild now. Just quickly as well, for those that are wondering what the visual difference is between the two part numbers, so like I said, these are all genuine parts. The bottom two, these are the original, of course. The top two, they are the new BMW part. As you can see, the oil way, or the oil channel, is thinner for whatever reason on the new part, and it is slightly wider on the old original part. Okay, so of course we are back to a bare block with the mains bearings still installed. I'm just going to make sure that they are seated perfectly flat with a straight edge. Yep, looking good. And now we can begin to install the oil squirters. So I have thoroughly cleaned these out. You don't want any grit of any kind in these. Okay, so that's all 4 oil squirters installed. Now I can go ahead and torque them down. Okay, so the oil squirters can be torqued down to 9 Newton meters. Which isn't a lot. There we are. And now we can begin to liberally lubricate the upper mains bearings. And then we can drop the thoroughly cleaned crankshaft into position. And now I can slide the thrust washers into position. There we are, those thrust washers are seated nicely. Now I'm going to make sure that this sealing surface is thoroughly clean with some brake cleaner, because obviously we still have the bearing carrier to go on as well. Don't want any kind of oil or grease on the sealing surface. I'll do the exact same to the bearing cap carrier as well. Again, just going to make sure that the bearings are sitting nice and flush in the caps. And now again we can liberally lube up these bearings. And now it's time to start applying the sealant, and for this I have went for Rhinzosil by Victor Rhinds. Should work quite well. So I'm going to apply half to the bearing cap carrier, then the other half to the block itself. So, yeah. It's that dowel, isn't it? How's the dowel looking on your end? Is it? It is. Try and lift it up a bit. I think it's going to go on square. Yeah, that's on, I think. That's it. Yeah, I can't really see too much has been squeezed out on the inside. The bearing carrier is now in. It's just a case of installing all the bolts now. So fresh new mains bolts. And then all of the outer bolts as well. Okay, so we'll start talking down the mains bolts now. I'll start in the middle. First stage is 30 Newton meters. There's one. There's two. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that's the first stage of all of the mains bolts. Now we can begin the talking of the outer casing bolts. Now these only have one stage, it's all just 9 Newton meters. But there is a sequence to it. It's fourth one along, so 1, 2, 3, 4. One, 2, 3. Yeah, that's right. As all of the outer casing bolts now torqued down to 9 Newton meters. Okay, so I thought before I do the final torquing stage of the mains bolts, obviously we still need to do a 150 degree rotation. Now the block, to do that I've got to get the block back into the engine stand. Now once the engine is in the engine stand, of course the bracket is going to be on the flywheel side. I'm not going to be able to get the oil seal in, so I think I'm going to install the oil seal first. Then I can get the block back on the engine stand, and then do the final torquing sequence. Now when it comes to installing the oil seal itself, it does come ready with this tool attached to it. Essentially this is to protect the inner lip from folding over. So I have oiled both the inner lip and the outer edge of the seal. And this can just go over the end of the crankshaft itself. Should be a perfect fit. And I can push the seal towards the block. And I just need to tap it around then until we have it nice and uniform. There we go then, rear main seal is in place. sitting nice and uniform. Let's get this thing on the engine stand now. Okay, so block back on the engine stand now. Let's get these 10 mains bolts torqued down to a further 150 degrees. And that's now all 10 mains bolts torqued down to 30 Newton meters plus 150 degrees rotation. Okay then, so as you can see, the engine is now the right way up and it's time to install the pistons. Now you probably noticed we already have 3 installed. I'm going to be showing you how to install the 4th one. Now I'm not going to lie, I've been having a bit of trouble getting these in because I've been using this piston ring compressor, and if I'm honest, it's not the greatest. This was relatively inexpensive if I was doing this job, and if I would recommend doing this to someone else, I'd recommend buying a bit of a higher quality piston ring compressor. You can make it work, I have made it work, but it's just not the best. But I'll show you exactly how I've been getting these pistons in anyway. Okay, and so of course, first step is to make sure the bore is nice and oiled. And what we'll also do is make sure the piston itself is well oiled. Now I have tried to make sure that the piston rings themselves are evenly spaced. You know, I mean the end gaps are evenly spaced. It doesn't really matter. I mean, in reality they are going to move around once the engine is running anyway, but it is just good practice to try and evenly space out the piston rings. So yeah, I have tried my best to do so. So the 3-piece oil control ring, the end gaps for the top and bottom of that, I have spaced that evenly apart, about 180 degrees, and the exact same with the upper and lower compression rings as well. But with the piston itself now well oiled, let's go ahead and drop it in the piston ring compressor. At this point as well, we also need to apply our assembly lube to the bearing itself. Okay, so as you can see, I've went ahead and tightened down the piston ring tool itself. I actually used a ratchet. I find you cannot get it anywhere near as tight as it needs to be to fully compress the piston rings with just the regular Allen key. You need a little bit more leverage. I mean, that could just be the nature of the tool. Like I said, it isn't the best, but we're making it work anyway. And now we can get the piston and connecting rod assembly flipped over and lower it down into the bore, making sure it is the correct way around. If you don't know which way around this is supposed to be, where it has these 2 grooves in the piston, that is the intake side. The other side where it is flat, that is the exhaust side. Yeah, we'll try and do it as straight as possible by eye. May have to readjust things slightly once we get the block flipped back over. That looks relatively straight. I'm just going to give the piston a couple of taps just so that we have the bottom portion of the piston protruding, so we can get it started in the bore. Okay, so the piston is in the bore now, so this should be nice and centralized. Now, in a further bid to keep the piston rings fully compressed, I'm going to insert this. It's just an aluminium ring essentially, so I can apply pressure to the top of the piston ring, because if I was to squeeze this, it is quite flimsy and you might end up distorting it essentially, and then you have a piston ring pop out. So I'm just going to apply pressure to the top of this, and then we'll just again begin tapping the piston, and hopefully it goes in well. Okay, so I think we're in, which is good. So we can remove this and the piston ring compressor tool itself, and just ensure that we are still looking pretty straight, which we are. So I'm just going to push the piston down slightly. We want it as close as possible to the journal, the big end journal on the crankshaft, of course. Yeah, I think that's gone over quite nicely, to be honest. So we can now rotate the engine. You can see it's not quite all the way up to the journal, so I'll just give it a few taps from below, or a push rather. There we go. That's came up nicely. As you can see, the rod there is sitting nicely on the bottom of the big end journal, ready to receive the cap. As you can see, I have applied some assembly lube to the cap, and I did write which was the intake side. So it is this side, which is on the engine, this side. Now it will only go on one way anyway. The where the brake is, it's a jagged edge, so it's not as if you can get this the wrong way around anyway. I should be able to drop this down into position. And now we can grab our brand new genuine BMW bolts and drop them into position. And again, just going to make sure that the piston is pushed towards the cap. And I'm going to screw these bolts down finger tight. Just get a socket on here, make it a bit easier. There we go, they're down finger tight now. I'll just rotate the crank. The bolt is still on the end of the crank, so I've just got an 18mm spanner. I'm just going to make sure first and foremost that the cap looks like it's on properly. Okay, so of course the rod bolts are only down a finger tight along with all of the others. I have checked the other 3 pistons, they seem to be moving nicely, so I'm pretty confident that they are fine, but we will flip over the engine, we'll start rotating the crank by hand just to make sure everything looks like it's moving as it should, and then if we can confirm there is no issues, then of course we will then torque down the bolts. You don't want to check to see if there's any issues after torquing down the bolts, because of course they are only one-time use bolts. After you have stretched them, you know, they're done. Then if you want to remove them, you have to then replace them again. Okay, so with the engine flipped back over, let's start rotating this crank. Everything seems to be moving nicely. No nasty scoring. Okay then, so it's now time to torque down the rod bolts. So First stage is just 5 Newton meters. I'm guessing this is just to ensure that all of the caps are sitting correctly. So yeah, I'm going to do all 8 of the new bolts down to 5 Newton meters, and then we'll do stage 2. Yeah, that's all 8 bolts down to 5 Newton meters. Oh, for those of you that are wondering, these new BMW bolts are different to the ones that I removed. So the ones that I removed from the engine were these eTorx bolts, which I think were an N14. These newer bolts, they are a 12 pointed bolt and they are a 9mm. So I had to buy especially for this job a 9mm 12 point socket. So if you are doing this job yourself, that's something to consider. Make sure you have one of these. The second stage of torquing then for the rod bolts is 10 Newton meters. So we'll go ahead and do that. There we go, that's all the rod bolts now torqued down to 10 Newton meters. Okay, so now ready for 130 degrees. And there's all 8. So we're now all of the rod bolts torqued down. I'll just rotate the engine a few more times just to make sure that the engine is still turning nicely. Which of course it is. And now it's time to install the sump baffle plate. This has again been thoroughly cleaned, along with the 4 bolts. So we can just drop this into position. I'm guessing it's, yeah, it can only go one way up, which is this way. Install all of those bolts. And I can torque these 4 bolts down to just 10 Newton meters. There we are. Next then of course is the installation of the oil pump, and I've went for a brand new genuine oil pump. As you can see, the build date on this was November 2021, and the makers of these genuine oil pumps is SHW, for those that are wondering. As you can see, made in Germany. And before I drop the oil pump into place, I'm just going to pour some oil right down its neck there, just to prevent it from running dry on initial startup. Now this may make a bit of a mess, but hey ho. That should do us. Any more and it's probably all just going to run out everywhere. So yeah, we'll flip it over. Drop it into position. Of course, just 3 bolts that hold this into place, which are these 3 Torx bolts right here. They are T45 bolts, and now I can torque them down to 25 Newton meters. There we are. And now it's time to begin the installation of the oil pump chain kit. So in the chain kit you should get the oil pump chain itself, of course, the oil pump sprocket bolt that has to be replaced, the camshaft pulley bolt, again, that has to be replaced, and then we should have a couple of sprockets as well. So the sprocket for the oil pump itself, then the sprocket that holds the oil pump chain onto the crankshaft. So first thing we'll do is install the oil pump sprocket itself. This just goes on like so. Of course, new bolt as well. Now sometimes oil pump sprocket bolts are left-handed threads. This one isn't though. Now when it comes to the torquing of this oil pump sprocket bolt, it is 5 Newton meters and then I believe an additional 90-degree rotation. Now I don't know what the official method of locking the oil pump is. You know, the fact that when you go to tighten this bolt, obviously you're just gonna turn the oil pump over. But what I am thinking is if I just place a screwdriver in here, and I should be able to do the first 5 Newton meters relatively easy. There's obviously not a lot of torque at all. There we are, that's 5 Newton meters done. Now maybe a bit more tricky when it comes to doing the 90 degrees, but I guess there's only one way to find out. Okay then, so like I said, I'm not sure the correct way that you're supposed to lock the oil pump, but that seemed to work quite well, although it was very, very eerie. It didn't seem right putting that much stress on such a small bolt. But we got there in the end. But I guess now we can install the oil pump chain itself and the sprocket that goes onto the end of the crankshaft. So what I'll do is drop the sprocket down this gap here, and then I'll make sure it clears the crankshaft, and I'll drop the chain over the oil pump sprocket. There we go, that's on there nicely. This just needs to slide over the crankshaft. Just going to make sure it's nice and lubed up. Some fresh engine oil. Just slide it over. Everything looks to be in place, moving nicely. And that's the oil pump assembly done. Now there is this oil pump cover, which I guess just slides into place. There we are, appear to be all clicked in. There we are then, here's how we're now looking. And I guess it's now time to reinstall the sump, the oil pan. Before we do that though, just have a couple of these blind plugs to install over these mains bolts. These obviously go on the outside of the sump. They're just like a protective cover, I guess, for the bolts, and probably more so nobody undoes them by accident. That would be a disaster, wouldn't it, if you was to, you know, try and remove something off of your engine and then it turns out you've actually just loosened your mains bolts. Just give these a bit of a tap. There we are, they look to be installed nicely. And now I'm just going to go around the perimeter of the block where the sump gasket sits, just to make sure it's free of any grease. Just have some brake cleaner on here, should get anything off that's going to be stopping the gasket from sealing properly. It's obviously already been scraped and cleaned. Now it's time to grab our new sump gasket, of course, genuine L-ring. Is there a way up and down with this thing? I don't think there is. I think it's just the exact same on both sides, so it shouldn't really matter which way up we place it. Just double check. Yeah, I can't see any indicator which says up or down of any kind. Let's drop it on. I'm telling a lie. The bolt holes don't line up that way, so it's got to be this way. There we are, much better. Yeah, you'll certainly know if you have this thing the right way up or not. Now we also have a brand new sump. The other was slightly rusted along the sealing edge, so I thought, you know, why not buy a new sump? It wasn't expensive. I mean, this isn't a genuine part, it is just a pattern part, but at the end of the day it's a sump. It has no moving parts, it's just responsible for holding your oil in your engine essentially. So yeah, should do the job quite nicely anyway, and should look a lot better than the old one. So again, of course, just one way this should go in. There's a bit of dust in here actually, let me give that a wipe out. Before that sump goes on, actually I'm just going to pour a little bit more oil down the pickup tube of the oil pump. Like I said, most of this is just going to end up on the floor, but we're doing all we can with this. And that'll do. And now the sump can go on. Just place it down gently. Just going to make some slight adjustments to the gasket just so that the bolts will sit nicely. And now we'll get our freshly painted bolts and begin installing them one by one. And with the sump bolts now in, here's how we're looking. Now any eagle-eyed viewers would notice that we are missing a bolt. There is 16 in total, but we only have 15. No idea how this is even possible. You know, I don't ever recall losing a bolt, but I guess we have, so I am going to have to buy a new single bolt. I'll just get that direct from BMW, and then of course we can begin the torquing sequence for the whole entire lot. I will however do that in the next part. The next part will be more than likely when we flip the engine back over, get the head installed, and then we can begin the timing of the engine, so we can get the timing chain in and we can get the thing all timed up correctly. But yeah, I think this video has gone on long enough, and I am going to leave this part here. Okay then, so like I said, I'm going to leave this part here. The Mini Cooper S engine block is now rebuilt, and hopefully the hard work is now over. Hopefully it's just going to be pretty plain sailing from here on in. but I guess we'll have to wait and find out. Again, I want to say a massive thanks to Lim Engine Parts for supplying the pistons for this engine. Again, all links will be down in the description box below. I want to say a massive thanks to Lee at Barham Engines as well. He, of course, rebored this block, and I don't think I would have been happy moving forward if I wasn't to get that done. Yeah, you know, at the end of the day, this engine would have been down on compression. It would have been burning oil, and you know, all the work that I've done, the money that I've spent on new parts and everything else, ultimately it wouldn't have been worth it if I was to have an unhealthy engine at the end of it. So yeah, I'm glad that I have taken my time and, you know, done the extra steps to ensure that this is pretty much going to be like a brand new engine when we're done, let's be honest. But yeah, I apologize for things taking a lot longer than they have. But yeah, hopefully, like I said, things are going to be plain sailing from here on in. But yeah, I want to thank all of you guys for watching anyway. Please give this video a like, leave a comment down below, subscribe if you have not already done so. I'll see you guys in that next one.